Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Pedalid. We're going to start from the second line, Tanu Rabbanan. I'm going to quote a bright. Hareze gitech al menat shetinasei leploni. Hareze lo tinasei v'nisei lo tetzei. We're going to have a bright. We're going to try to explain it. We're going to end up with three different explanations of this bright. So the first simple reading. This is your get. In this simple reading, I won't actually explain it in a particular way. We'll just raise the issues of what's not clear. This is your get under the condition that you marry a specific person. This is a bit of a strange thing for a husband to do, and we'll talk about in the Gemara why the Gemara doesn't like this, why the Brayta doesn't like this. But he basically says to her, this is your get. You can only marry a particular person. This is like the opposite of you're permitted to everybody except for one person. Here we're basically saying the condition of the divorce is that you marry so-and-so. So, Hareza lo tinasei, she can't marry. We don't know who she can't marry. Can she not marry the person who he said? Can she not marry anybody else? Ve'im nisei lo tetzei, and if she does marry, whoever this is, fill in the blank, then she doesn't have to get divorced, meaning she shouldn't do it, but it's valid in any case. My kamar, so what is this Brayta saying exactly? First explanation, Amar Rav Nachman, hachi kamar, this is what it says. Harezo lo tinasei lo. If the husband says, you're divorced, under the condition that you marry so-and-so, she can't marry so-and-so. Maybe you were thinking about this, right? But this is abuse of women, basically. People are going to say, oh, look, he's giving his wife as a gift to somebody else. He's basically saying, I'm divorcing you, and you're permitted only to marry so-and-so. Right? Why husband want to do this? Good question. But he is obviously a person with some issues. And basically he's saying, right, or at least it looks like, he's giving his wife away as a gift. Now, a woman is not a toy to pass around and say, oh, I don't want you, but I'm giving you to somebody else. Again, further proof, right, for all the Gemaras that we've seen that seem to go somewhat against women, or again, I don't know that any of these two are really against women, but relating to the way they treated women in those days, this is further proof of one of the many sources where we see that the Torah comes out, or the rabbis come out, to protect women and say, we won't allow this type of thing to happen. Now, the problem is that she's not really married. So now, she's not really divorced because she didn't fulfill the condition. So the Gemara says, therefore, she can't really marry anybody else, but if she does marry someone else based on this divorce, we don't make her get divorced. To which the Gemara says, how could you possibly say this? Mishum gzeira. In other words, because of gzeira, we're not going to allow this condition to be fulfilled. So, lo mafkina mina v'sharina eshet ish la'alma. And how could we possibly, because of a gzera, we're going to basically say that we can allow this woman? And the gzera is we don't really accept this kind of a condition. But the fact is, he did make a condition, and because he made a condition, how can we possibly say this woman who theoretically didn't really get a get is now permitted to marry somebody else, and we're not going to make her get divorced from him? That's very weird. So, to which the Gemara says, Ela Amar Rav Nachman, so Rav Nachman changes his explanation. Option number 2, Hachi Kamar. Harezo lo tinasei lo. That stays the same. She can't marry the person he said, Shemo Yemunu Shehem Notnim B'matana. But the second part, Im niseit lo tetzei, is if she marries this person, she's not allowed to marry. He says only marry so-and-so. She goes ahead, marry so-and-so, even though the rabbi said she shouldn't. Well, then she doesn't have to get divorced because of Xera, we don't make her get divorced. That already makes a lot more sense. However, I told you there are going to be 3 explanations, which means we're going to have an issue with this one also. Amalei Rava. Lohu de lo tinasei. Now, the inference Rava is going to make from Rav Nachman is, it sounds like she can't marry him, but it sounds like she can marry anybody else. Hala acher tinasei. Now, you don't necessarily have to make that inference, and that's what we're going to say in option number 3. But right now, we're going to say that it seems like Rav Nachman is wrong, because now, la'acher tinasei, how could she possibly marry somebody else? Habaya l'kiyumei t'na'ah. She would have to fulfill her condition in order to be a divorced woman, like we said in the previous. She hasn't fulfilled her condition. If you want to say that, maybe you could say the following. She's married to Joe. Okay, then Joe says, you have to marry Bob. Okay, So Joe says, you must marry Bob. It's the only way it'll work. Then she goes and marries David. Okay? So now she goes to marry David. The whole question is, how can she marry David? Well, the point is, maybe she can marry David today, divorce him tomorrow, and then fulfill the condition and marry Bob. So that means that since marrying David doesn't preclude her from ultimately marrying Bob, maybe she's allowed to marry David now because she could theoretically, and hopefully will, eventually fulfill the condition, which will mean, this is a little bit complicated, but it'll mean that retroactively the divorce was effective from before. So again, Joe divorces her, let's say on Sunday. She marries David on Monday. She divorces David on Tuesday. Now I know there's a bit of a problem here. She can't really divorce. She can't initiate divorce. We're going to get back to that. Only David can decide to divorce her. It's not really in her control. We'll come back to that. But right now, what he's suggesting is maybe you could say that she should be able to marry David today because theoretically on Thursday, let's say she could marry Bob, fulfill the condition. Turns out she was divorced already from Sunday. Ulahat. So now, if you're going to say this, ulahafta pligat alei de Rav Yehuda kamidametle, and then Rav Nachman, you're basically saying the same thing if you say this option. You give her this possibility, if that's what you're saying again. Because let's just start from the beginning. The second reading of Rav Nachman was she can't marry Bob because it looks like, right, he's giving a gift. By the way, if she marries David in the middle, then already she decides to marry Bob after, then already it doesn't look like Joe is giving her away as a gift to Bob. So that would actually work. So now, lahafta pligat alei de Rav Yehuda kamidametle, you're basically holding by the same position that you have in a different machloket. This is totally different machloket, but you'll see the similarity in a minute. De'itmar. Rav Yehuda and Rav Nachman disagree about the following case. We learned this in Nadarim. Konam enai b'shena hayom im eshan l'macha. Okay, what does this mean? I basically say, the vow is going to apply that today will be forbidden for me to sleep by a vow if I sleep tomorrow. Now, tomorrow hasn't come yet. It's today. Am I allowed to sleep or am I not allowed to sleep? Is it forbidden to me by a vow or not? It depends. If I don't sleep tomorrow, then it won't be forbidden to me to sleep today. But if I sleep tomorrow, then today will be forbidden to me. So, Amar Rav Yehuda, al yishan hayom, shem yishan l'machal. Yehuda says you have to be concerned. Maybe tomorrow you'll end up falling asleep. And therefore, don't sleep today, because if you fall asleep tomorrow, today will have turned out to be forbidden to you. Rav Nachman Amar, yishan hayom ve'en chashashim shem yishan l'machal. You can sleep today. You don't have to worry that maybe you'll fall asleep tomorrow. Tomorrow you'll deal with tomorrow. Tomorrow you'll make sure not to fall asleep. And then today it'll actually be permitted for me to sleep. So now, what's the comparison? The comparison is the same thing here. She can marry David, the third guy, today, because just because she hasn't yet fulfilled her condition doesn't mean she won't fulfill her condition down the road. She can always get divorced from David, go marry Bob, fulfill her condition, and it turns out retroactively she was divorced from the beginning. So he basically says to Rav Nachman, is that the way you're explaining this based on that? And if that's what you're saying, here comes Rava's problem with it. He says you really can't compare these cases. And this is exactly what I mentioned before. In the case of the sleeping, it's up to him whether he sleeps or not the next day. Now, you might say sleep is not exactly in your control. So they give a little bit of an unpleasant description, but you could take thorns, right, and kind of prick yourself to keep yourself awake. You can come up with solutions to how to keep yourself awake the next day. But she can't divorce herself. It's not in her control at all. We've been learning that the whole Masechet. It's not in her control. So therefore, since she can't initiate the divorce, this is not the same kind of situation. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense to say that she's allowed to marry somebody else because she can eventually fulfill the condition later. It's really not in her control, and therefore Rava rejects Rav Nachman's explanation, or really we could kind of say he modifies it. So here's option number 3. Ela Amar Rava. Again, we're still trying to explain this first Braita we started with. How do we read the Braita? Harei zo lo tinaseh lo v'lo la'acher. She can't marry not him and not anyone else. lo tinaseh shema yomru neshehem notnim b'matana. She can't marry anyone. She can't marry Bob because then it looks like Joe is giving her to Bob as a gift. La'achir lo tinaseh debai lekimei litnai. She can't marry anybody else because she hasn't fulfilled the condition. That fits with what Rava's problem was with Rav Nachman. Ve'im niseit lo tetzei mishum gzera lo mafkina. And if she marries him, though, she marries now Bob, she doesn't have to get divorced because of gzera, we don't make her get divorced. Remember, it was just gzera. We didn't want this to happen. Once it happens already, we let it go. But, and now he adds, la'achel, but if she marries someone else, tetzei, because she's not actually divorced. Because she didn't fulfill the condition, debai l'kiyumei litnei, because she has to fulfill the condition. Tanya kavatei de Rabba, and here's a braita that supports Rabba's reading. Hareza lo tinaseh lo v'lo la'achir. She can't marry him, not anybody else. Ve'im niseit lo tetzei la'achir tetzei. This exact distinction. If she marries him, she's allowed to stay married to him, but if she marries someone else, she has to get divorced because she has to leave the marriage because she never really was divorced from her first husband. So she hasn't fulfilled the condition, and that braita supports the final reading of Rabba. Tanu Rabbanan, another braita. Now we go to a condition. This is going to be the main topic for the rest of the day, or almost, which is Hareze gitech amanat shetali larakia, or at least for the next section. This is your get under the condition that you go up to the heavens. Nobody can go up to the heavens. They didn't have air travel in those days. Al manat shetardila tahom, that you go down all the way into the depths of the sea. Al manat bal'i kanesh al arba amot, on the condition that you eat a reed that's 400 cubits long. 4 cubits long. 400 we're going to get to in a second. Al manat tavi li kaneh be'me'ama. You bring me a reed that's 100 cubits. Okay, all these things are impossible. That you walk across the Mediterranean, also impossible. According to Tanakama, this is not a get. Okay, it's not a valid statement at all, and it's not a get. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema Omer, kazeh get. This is a get. Okay, so now let's understand their opinions. So, okay, where is it? Okay, so now, why is this a get or not a get? Klal Amar, so let's just keep reading a little bit longer. Klal Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, kol t'nai she'i afshar lo l'kaymo b'sofo, v'hitzna alav mitchilato, eno ela k'mafliga b'dvarim v'kashim. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema says, and then we'll get to the rabbis who disagree. Any condition that can't be ultimately fulfilled, and you made a condition in the get, is only trying to basically torture her. He's basically trying to be mean to her and say, oh, here's your get, kind of like waving at her face, but only if you do something insane. Okay, but it's really not true. He's just exaggerating and trying to torture her, but he doesn't really mean it. And therefore, it's a get. The rabbis say this is a ridiculous thing to say, and therefore it's not a get at all. Okay, so with the rabbis, you could read it otherwise, which is she has to fulfill the condition and she can't fulfill the condition. So basically it's not a get. And then we're going to see now, Amar Rav Nachman. First of all, I want you to notice, because we're going to get back to this. Number one, Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema says, kazeh get. This is a get, which seems to be saying this and not something else like it. But then he gives a klal, which is usually always coming to include something additional. So to support himself, he says there's a klal. Here's the general rule, which usually is coming to include. So later we're going to get back to what's it excluding and what's it including. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Nachman Amarav, Rav Nachman paskins in the name of Rav Halachat Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema. We actually hold like him. We don't hold like the rabbis, even though he's an individual. And basically we say this is a get, and there's no condition to the get because the condition was meaningless. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, you can also infer this from our Mishnah. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, the Katani, it says in our Mishnah, it says in our Mishnah, anything that you can ultimately fulfill, and he makes a condition in the beginning about it, then the condition is valid. Now, what does this seem to infer? If it's not capable of being done, then the t'nai doesn't count. Shema minas, you can infer exactly that. Now we get to an interesting debate or question, Rav and Abaye about how to answer this question, and then we're going to try to connect it with what we just talked about. Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema. He says, this is you get under the condition that you eat pork. Now, you can't eat pork, it's forbidden. Is that something that's impossible or not? Because it is actually possible. You'll just get like you're not allowed to, but it is physically possible. So, Ma, Amar Abaye, Abaye says exactly the same thing. It's impossible to eat pork, so therefore it's not a condition. Rava Amal, Efshar da'achla velakeh. She could actually eat, get punished for it, get lashes, but she could actually eat. So it actually is a condition in the get. So now, how do we understand the whole klal? When we said, now they're both according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Taim. So the question is, when he said we're including a case, so klal la'atuye la'abaye, klal la'atuye basar chazil. So the klal, the word, when he said here it's a general rule, the general rule was to include even a case of eating pork, which is a little different, but it's impossible for halachic reasons. L'Rava kazeh l'mi'ute basar chazil. He said, no. There's kazeh get. This is a get, but not any other case. So meaning not the case of basar chazil. So the first question is going to be addressing Rava's opinion. Then we're going to go to a question about. We're going to go back and L'Rav meti. And this is kind of like the other guy who said you have to marry so-and-so. He says you have to sleep with so-and-so, which probably means go marry him and have relations with him. So here's your get under the condition that you have relations with this person. Okay, we're not yet at the question. So if this basically is a good, valid condition. So if she fulfills the condition, it's a get. If not, not. It's actually kind of funny because then as she gets married, she's actually getting divorced at the same time. But again, the divorce will take effect from the time she got the get, so it will work. By the way, this could mean just having relations with him, not marriage, particularly. Again, even though that's really not permitted. Okay, under the condition that you don't have relations with my father or your father. This is a totally different issue. We don't have to worry. Some people say, even if she was alone in a room with them, we don't have to be concerned that maybe they have relations and that the get is not a get. Now, what's the difficulty? What's not in this Mishnah? Notice it said that you sleep with so-and-so and that you don't sleep with my father or your father. What's not mentioned? It doesn't say anywhere under the condition that you sleep with my father or your father. Now, that's a rayot. That's forbidden. That would be like basar chazil. Only under the condition you do something forbidden. Okay, sleeping with someone outside of marriage is not as forbidden. It's not recommended, but it's not forbidden in the same way as sleeping with one of the arayot. So So this works with Abaye because this is not a Tanai. It's not listed here because the Braita was listing conditions that are valid. This is not a valid condition. You don't sleep with my father because it's forbidden. So the Rava Kasha, but to Rava, this should actually be a condition, right? It's just forbidden for her to do, but so what? She could do it and get death penalty, or in days when there's not death penalty, so she'll just get punished. When it comes to basar chazir, it's actually in her power to do it because she could eat basar chazir. We're now going to go back to something we talked about before. And Poloni nani afshar the mishachta lebemamon. Even if he says you have to marry so-and-so or sleep with so-and-so, she can always bribe him with money to do it for her. So the condition of her get is fulfilled. But even if it's to marriage, you could say, she'll pay the person, they'll marry her, they'll divorce her the next day. It's not like they have to stay married. But she can't control if she has relations with his father or her father. She might be willing, in order to get her get, to do something that's forbidden. But the father or the father-in-law aren't going to want to do something that's forbidden. They're basically committing a sin for no reason from their sake, their perspective. So therefore, since it takes two to tango, there's someone on the other side, it's not in her control to do. So now they're going to go back and explain what's the klal and what's the kazeh, the limitation, right? The including, what are we including, what are we excluding according to Rabbanit Abaye. So now, that's what the klal is coming to include. The case of Abba Vavicha, which is forbidden, but since it's not in her control, that's going to be similar to going up to the heavens. And the kazeh get, this is a get, is coming to exclude the eating pork. Turning now to Amabet, La'abaye, klal atuye basar chazil, kazeh lemi'ute ploni. Tabaye, the klal is coming to include the case of basar chazir. You don't even need to include the case of abba babich. That's obvious. If you include basar chazir, that includes that too. Tazeh is l'miyute ploni. If he says, under the condition that you sleep with ploni, you have relations with ploni, that she can actually convince him to do it, and therefore, and it actually could be done in a permissible way. Rashi even says that biyadallah hashchido b'mamon, she could bribe him v'yisa'ena behetir. He can marry her in a permitted manner. So she's not forcing anyone to do anything forbidden, and in that case, we actually would say the get is a get, and the condition is valid only if she does it. So that was, again, we started with a question on Rava, then we went to explain what's the klal and prod according to the inclusion and the exclusion according to each one. And now we're going to a question on Abaye. This is your get if you eat pork. If she's a non-Kohen, or not Kohen, or not married to a Kohen, under the condition that you eat truma, which is forbidden to her to eat. Nizira, if she was a Nizira, right there, by the way, the previous she'd have to be a Bat Kohen. This was saying when you go back to your father's house, you'd have to eat Truma, she'd have to be a non-Bat Kohen that wouldn't be allowed to eat Truma then. If she was a Nizira, he says, you have to drink wine, which she's forbidden to do. So here, it seems very clear that the condition is a condition, because only if she fulfills the condition is she divorced. If not. That's clearly Rava against Abaye. So the Rava nichal Abaye kashi. Amar l'cha Abaye can answer. Misavar divrei akoli. Remember, both of them are explaining Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema. According to the rabbis, even if you say go up to the heavens, it's a valid t'nai, and just she's not divorced, right? It's just not a get. So now Abaye says, Misavar divrei akoli hamani rabbanani. This is the rabbis who view this as a valid condition. If she wants to do something crazy like eat pork, she could, and she might get punished for it, but she could fulfill her get. And if she doesn't, it won't be a get. That's the rabbis. I was trying to explain Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, so don't question me from this breita. I wasn't explaining this opinion. Now the Gemara asks this whole thing about the basar chazir. He makes this condition on the condition that you eat basar chazir. V'tepukle, why don't you just say why don't you just simply say this is not a valid t'nai, not because it's impossible, right? This whole machloket Abaye Rava isn't impossible, is not impossible. But why don't you just say this is making a condition against something that says in the Torah? Anyone who makes a condition against something that says in the Torah, the condition is invalid. You can't say, I'm making a condition to eat pork. So how could he say, here's your get under the condition that you eat pork? Here's a good example of a t'nai matna mashkatu b'torah. He marries her under the condition that he will refrain from giving her the three things that the Torah says he has to give her, which is sher, ksut, and onah, right, which is food, covering, clothing, shelter, and sexual relations. He says, I'm not going to give you those. Now that's making a stipulation against what it says in the Torah, and that's invalid. Dehu ka'akar. Now, what's the reason there? Because he made the condition, and it goes against what his rights are, what he's supposed to give her by Torah law. Aval hacha I ka'akar. But she's the one uprooting it here. He made the stipulation that she eat pork, and she's the one who has to eat pork. It's not the same person who made the stipulation. To which Matkef La Ravina, that's not an issue, because in the end, klum ka'akra ihi l'tanai didei. She's only going against that. Why is she's uprooting his stipulation only because, and she's basically going against the Torah only on account of what he said. Ishtakach de ihi ihu ka'akra. In the end, it's really he who's uprooting what's by Torah law. Because if my husband says to me, here's you get into the condition that I eat pork, says to me that you eat pork. So in that case, he's making me go against the Torah. So that's why it's really on him. It is really a stipulation that goes against the Torah. It doesn't matter that I'm the one who's going to eat the pork. So therefore, Ela Maravina, he's going to have to explain why this isn't Moshe Katuv Torah. Because that's not the reason. It's two different people here. Because We're now going to again compare it to there. That's our classic case that we have. But what does he say is unique about that? When he makes that stipulation, he's basically saying, I'm not providing you with this. And it's definitely uprooting Torah law, 100%. There's no other possibilities. When he makes this stipulation, theoretically, she doesn't have to eat pork. She could just not eat pork. And then she just won't be divorced. But it's not like it has to happen. In the Sherek Sudanonah case, it has to happen. He's basically definitely going to override with the Torah laws. Here, there's a potential that it won't be overridden because she just won't eat pork and she won't get divorced. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that she's now stuck and she can't ever do it. Now, it's true she's stuck because if she doesn't want to eat pork, she's going to be stuck. But let's say she doesn't care and she's willing to override the halacha. Since potentially, now this is the important part, since potentially at the time he gives the divorce, he makes the divorce, makes the statement and conditions it upon eating pork, there's a possibility that she just won't eat pork and won't fulfill the get. Since there's a possibility that it's not necessarily going against the Torah law, therefore it's not considered in the category of matnel mashka Torah. Okay, so even if in the end she does, and it is matnel mashka Torah, that doesn't matter. Because in the beginning, when he made the condition, there was a possibility that it could have been she didn't have to eat the pork. Okay, and therefore, that's why it's not a case of matnel mashka Torah. Ketzad yaseh. Now we're back to the Mishnah. So our Mishnah had said, let's just go back for a minute, all the way back on Pebed. You divorce your wife and you say, Arat mutar l'chol adam, but not so-and-so. Then we said, even though, right, the rabbi said it doesn't work, so what does he have to do? He has to take the get back, give it to her a second time. So now we're going back to that line. Ketzad yaseh yitzlena himena. Man Tana, who's this Tana? Amar Chizkiah Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Did Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer, Ad sheyitzlenu himena, v'yachzor v'yitznena la v'yomar la hegitech. He said in this other case that we saw a few pages ago, it was Ayin, just look back, Ayin Chet, that there's a case there where she doesn't realize it's the get, so he has to give it back to her a second time. Okay, v'yomar la hegitech, and then he has to tell her, this is your get. But Rebbe disagreed there and said, you don't have to. So Rabbi Yochanan says, afilu tema Rebbe. Even Rebbe, I can explain. Even Rebbe, who said there, that if you gave her this document, she didn't know it was a get. You don't have to give it to her again. You just have to say, that's your get. That's different than this case. Dilchon Amar, and Rabbi Yochanan quotes Rav Kahana, who came from Babylonia to Israel. And when he came, Rabbi Yochanan was so taken by him, and he started asking him all these halachot. So now he's quoting Rav Kahana, and he says, Dilchon means shelachem, yours, meaning you're Babylonian. He says this to Chizkiah. Chizkiah came from Babylonia. So he says, you're Babylonian, and as people from your hometown explained it the following way. And that's explained, he was talking right to Chizkiah, who said it's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. So he says to Chizkiah, no, I'm going to explain it even according to Rebbe, and even your rabbis from there, Babylonia, they explain the following. This is different. Because when he gives this get to the woman and says, this is your get, right, and then says under the condition that you eat pork. So in that case, I'm sorry, my mistake. This is your get. You're permitted to everyone except for so-and-so. We already learned that it apostles her for kahuna, right? She now can't marry a Kohen, even though she's not divorced from everybody, even if the one guy, right, whatever. Either which way, she's apostle for kahuna. That means that this get was actually a given. She actually gave her a valid get. It wasn't fully valid, but it had some sort of validity. In that case, if he wants to say this is your get and fix it, and say this is your get and now you're divorced, you're muteret, you're permitted to everybody, he would have to take it back from her and give it to her again. He can't fix that according to Rebbe the way he can fix the other one. The other one, when he just gave her without telling her what it was, and then later says, oh, by the way, that's your get. That's sufficient because the first giving was nothing. So now we could just clarify. In this case, the first giving had validity because it apostled her for other kohanim. That's enough to basically say, now you have to give it to her again, even according to Rebbe. Ktavo b'tocho. Now the Mishnah had said, if you write inside the get, and then you erase it, you write your muteret l'chol adam, other than so-and-so, which is no good according to the rabbis, you erase it, it's pasul. Okay, you can't use that get again. So Amrav Safra Katvo B'tochotna. It's only if you write it inside. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, Katvo B'tochotna. What do you mean? That's exactly what it says in the Mishnah. Why are you telling us this? We know it says that in the Mishnah. To which he answers, Mao Detemi, you might have thought, or the Gemara answers for us, you might have thought, Hani Milin Achar HaTorah. Maybe that's only if you wrote it after you wrote the important part. And when you wrote the important part, it was written properly. And it's still problematic. Aval Lifnei HaTorah, that's after the Torah, if you write it inside, it's a problem. And that's even if it's after the Torah, but only if you write it. Aval Lifnei HaTorah, afilu al pen nami pasul. But before you write the important part of the get, and that's if the normal case was you give her the get, and as you're giving her the get, you say Aram Mutar L'Chol Adam after the whole thing was written. What if you wrote the get, the important parts of the get, after you already said Haram Mutar L'Chol Adam other than so and so, I'm not permitting you to so and so, and then you wrote the get knowing that that was how he was giving the get. You might have thought Afilu al pen nami pasul, that even if he just said it, but it was before the get was written, it would be a problem. Kamash malan. That's why it's telling you that even if it was written inside, right? Written inside, it doesn't matter when it was written inside. Written inside is a problem. But only if it's written, not if it was said orally. Even if it was said orally before you wrote the get, that doesn't disqualify the get itself. Again, you can't give it to her that way. You have to say you're permitted to everybody. But if you told the sofer, let's say, I want you to write this get that I'm going to give and permit her only to certain people, or not to everybody, that doesn't invalidate the get itself. The Rava has a different explanation. Lo shanu ela la'achar haTorah. Aval lifnei, the whole thing about the writing is only after the Torah is written. That it's a problem, or again, that it's specifically going to be a problem if it's written, but if it was done orally after the Torah, it doesn't disqualify the get itself. Aval lifnei Torah fafilu al pen nami pasul. But if it's before you wrote the Torah, the important part of the get, he said to the sofer, I'm going to do this, and I'm only permitting her to, I'm going to give it to her under condition that she not be permitted to certain people, or I'm going to permit her to everyone other than so-and-so. Then, even Baal Peh Nami Pasul, if it was before the Torah, then the get was written with that in mind, even though it doesn't say anything in the get, it would even be a problem. And he goes according to his own explanation in general. He's consistent with his opinion. He told people who were writing gets, make sure not to listen to anything the husband says. Silence them. Make sure they don't talk until you finish writing the get. Just tell them, shh, be quiet, I'm focusing, until you write the Torah of the get, so that they don't say anything like that and actually disqualify the writing of the get. So there you see that Rav is consistent with his opinion. So according to the first reading, which didn't come with anyone's name, or maybe it's an explanation of Rav Safra, that it's only if it's written, this is disqualified. According to Rava, it's disqualified even if you thought it, if the husband intended it, if he intended it before it was written, then it's a problem. Tanu Rabbanit. Finishing up with this Braita, and we're going to have more explanation of this Braita tomorrow. Kol Tanaim poslim beget divrei Rebbe. All types of conditions disqualify get. We're going to have to understand what this means. The Chachamim omrim kol sheposel al peh posel b'ktav. Whatever disqualifies orally, disqualifies it in writing. V'kol she'eino posel al peh, eino posel b'ktav. And what doesn't disqualify orally doesn't disqualify in writing. Chutz, so now we're going to have an explanation. Chutz sheposel al peh posel b'ktav. You're going to give the get orally and say you're permitted to everyone other than so and so. It's going to disqualify it a get if you write it in the get, right? Then the get becomes disqualified. That's what we mean here about kol sheposel al peh posel b'ktav. And what's not posel? What's that? Al menat she'eino posel al peh eino posel b'ktav. Al menat, if under the condition that you marry so and so that doesn't disqualify the whole thing. Baal peh, okay, because you can have a condition. There's actually a debate here. Is the condition any condition in a get that works, right? Al menat, that you give me 200 zuz or something, is not posel b'chtav. So if you write that in the get, it's not going to disqualify. Okay, so what exactly are we talking? And then the rabbis say, Rebbe says, kol ha'taneim poslim beget. If you write any of these in the get, it will actually disqualify the get. So what does that mean? It will disqualify the get. There's a huge machloket here between the commentaries, what we're talking about. I'm going to go with Tosfot here in my explanation, the Ri who's quoted in Tosfot. It's in the big Tosfot, Kol HaTanaim Poslim Beget. About halfway through, it says, Benir Eleri. De Kol HaTanaim Im Nitkaimu Afilu Nichtevu Beget Kasher. First, he says, this whole thing about it being written in the get is a problem, is only a problem if you don't fulfill the condition. If you write almanat that you're going to give me 200 zuz, or chutz mi, whatever you write, it doesn't matter. Again, certain things will matter. Chutz can't be written in the get, that we know. But if you do it, if you fulfill the condition and it was written in the get's obviously a good get. What we're talking about here is, and then if you look down a few more lines, what if you erased it? The whole Mishnah talked about erasing. It doesn't help if you erase the get. If you wrote chutz, it's disqualified even if you erase. Here they're saying if you erased it before you gave her the get, even if you didn't fulfill the condition, it's fine. That's what we mean about if it's an almanat, which doesn't disqualify a Baal Peh. If you give her the get and say, on the condition that you give me 200 zuz, it's not going to disqualify if you wrote it in and you erased it. If it's that kind of thing which can be written in the get, then if you erased it, it doesn't disqualify the get. And unless you gave her the get stipulating that condition, you wouldn't actually have to keep that condition at all, even though you originally wrote it. Okay? So that's the way he says it. Okay? And then you wouldn't need, and then the whole question is, Rebbe says, none of all these are going to disqualify, because why? Rebbe wants to avoid you writing the words Haran Muteret chutz mi so and so and erasing it and thinking that's okay, and that's what we're going to see right now. Amar Rabbi Zera machloket lifnei hatoref. The machloket is before you wrote the toref, you wrote this condition in. To Rebbe savar gazrinan almanat atu chutz. Rebbe says we're saying it's a problem of almanat because if you think almanat you can erase and then you won't have to fulfill the condition or for the get to be valid, well, then you might think that chutz is okay to write in, and chutz is not okay under any circumstance. So therefore, it's a problem. Rabbanan savre lo gazrinan almanat atu chutz. We don't make that kind of example. Aval lachar toref, but if it's after the toref, divrei hakol kasher, everybody agrees that it's kasher. So now Tosfot here says, if you look, we're now at the top of Pehamad Aleph, we're going to finish here. What's the reason? Well, that's because chutz is only pasul after the toref because of gzeira. Okay? Because as long as you wrote the get, if you write chutz after the toref, it's only gzeira atu lifnei toref. And lo gazrin gzeira al gzeira, and therefore we're going to be lenient if you did it after the toref. Okay, for almanat, because we're not going to be gozer because of chutz. Okay, so just to review from the beginning of the daf, we started with this brayta that we had 3 different readings of. This is again on the condition that you marry or have relations with so and so. I'm sorry, that you marry so and so, and then because we don't want it looking like people are giving their wives away as gifts. This is right. She can't marry that person. Then we eventually had to figure out, well, who can she marry and who doesn't she have to get divorced from, right? And in the end, we said she really can't marry anybody because she's really stuck. By the way, it's a classic case of a naguna of a woman who's really stuck if he does this to her. Anyway, it's a very odd to think he would anyway do that. Then we got into this whole thing about ridiculous things like that you go into the heavens, that you go down to the depths, all those things that are impossible. From there, we tried to compare it. What about eating non-kosher or something forbidden? Is that we saw Abaye and Rava different? Abaye says the exact same thing. Rava says not the same thing because you can actually do it. And then we got into why is it not a matna mashkatu b'torah? Then we got to the whole thing of he has to re-give her the get, and how does that relate to this machloket of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and Rebbe that we saw previously? Is it the same machloket, or maybe Rebbe would agree here that actually you would have to give it to her again? And then we had this thing about writing it and the writing, and whether it's before the Torah, after the Torah. And then we had those 2 explanations of what if you had in mind before the Torah was written? Does that disqualify it or not? Does that disqualify the entire get, or does it not? We saw the 2 interpretations. And then we ended with this machloket Rebbe and Chachamim, which we'll start with again tomorrow and explain from the beginning, and then move on to what the Gemara is going to do with it further on. Wishing everybody a great day.